plants have a problem compared to animals. They can't move. So you can see the plants in front here, they just stay there and they can't move. My conviction was at one stage shaken when I drove in on the British roads and there was a signpost saying, heavy plant crossing. I don't know if you have seen that in Britain. And I was expecting a big plant to cross the road. But in fact, plant in English also means a big machine. So now I'm convinced plants can move. Now, animals have an advantage that an advantage, maybe also a disadvantage for the males, because the males need to convince the females to have intercourse and to have copulation. But plants can't do that. The thing is that all living organisms have male gametes that have to move, have to swim to the female gametes that just stay there. The egg cells just stay there. They wait for the males to come. So the male have to swim to the females. And we've seen that in the lower plants have a bit of a problem because they need a humid, watery environment for the males to swim to the females. So here you have the life cycle of a fern. So the fern growing on dry ground, producing spores. And the spores will only germinate in a humid aquatic environment to produce male gametes that can swim to the egg cells and fertilize the eggs to produce a new plant. So lower plants are, in fact, a bit sort of constricted in their possibilities. When we look at the higher plants, the conifers and the flowering plants, these plants have overcome that problem of a wet, humid environment. In fact, they produce the male parts of the flower produce stamens that have pollen grains, and the pollen grains they have to move to the female part, which is the ovary that has the ovules. Then you get fertilization and you get a new plant. Now, that process of transfer of the pollen to the female part is called pollination. Now, in lower plants, the gametes could move, but the problem with pollen can't move. So they need an intermediate factor to help them move. And in the conifers, it's usually the wind. But in the higher plants, it is usually an insect, certainly at the base, that acts as a kind of matchmaker. It's like a wedding where the male has to move to the female. And that interaction between the insects and the plant, the flowers, leads to a high evolutionary change. So we can say, in fact, that flowers only exist because there are insects. Otherwise, we wouldn't have flowers. We wouldn't have attractive petals to look at. So that's a very important fact. So we could say that flowers are a bit like commercial enterprises, like shops, because flowers have a problem. They have to be noticed by the pollinator, and they have to be sure that the pollinator comes back to transfer the pollen to another flower. So a flower needs to be advertised, and it needs to lure the insect to go into the shop, the customer. Once in the shop, it will find goods to buy. And for bees, that's nectar to produce honey, of course. But the flower asks the insects to do a service, and that service is basically the possibility to reproduce. Now, to get that service repeated, the flowers need the insect to come back. So they create something like a loyalty card. So the insects are sure to come back. So how can the flowers attract the pollinators? There are, in fact, three signals that the flowers can use. And in fact, they function in sort of in sequential order. First, we have an olfactory signal. So the smell, the fragrance can be felt by insects from a long distance. The insects can sort of catch the chemical signals of scent and be attracted to the flowers. Then the insects need to see the flowers, so there's the shape and the color is important. And that's where the flowers become interesting for us humans, because they are sort of visual. And then last step is a sensory signal, which is a touch signal. When the pollinator lands on the flower, it needs to be sort of triggered in some ways. So the olfactory stimulus is quite important. If you think about night-pollinated flowers that are pollinated by moths, it's dark, so the only way for the moth to find the flowers is by the fragrance that is sent out by the flowers. And so the moths come from far away, and they will pollinate these flowers in the dark. It can also be this kind of crude smell, like this kind of flower, which imitates the smell of rotten meat. So flies will be attracted to these flowers, and they will come from far distance to lay their eggs in the flower. A very specific sort of scent system has evolved in certain orchids that are pollinated by male bees. I'll speak a bit more about that later, but what is interesting is that the orchids reproduce the same scent as the sexual pheromones of female bees to attract the males. So these are different species, and that shows, in fact, the gas chromatography of the different chemicals that make up the scent. Okay, now we have something that attracts us all as humans, which are the flowers. And flowers have evolved a whole range of ways to attract the pollinators visually. And it's just by transforming or by creating different parts in the flower or in the whole plant that they made it possible to attract these the pollinators. So we can have flowers here, like this is a cactaceae that produces a perianth, which is showy, like petals or sepals. But it can also be stamens. Stamens can be attractive, like in callistemon here. It can also be a floral tube, and a hypanthium, like in Cuphea here. The perianth is very small here. The petals and sepals are almost reduced. It can also be an extra structure in the flower, like in Passiflora. It's sort of corona, we call that, a crown. And sometimes you get a lot of small flowers that group together and create a pseudoflower, something that looks like a flower, which has a group of flowers. So the peripheral flowers are sterile, they are sort of more like petals and attractive, and the central flowers are the flowers that are fertile. So this is the common pattern that you all know from the composites, the Asteraceae. There's another way as well where bracts or sort of leaves, upper leaves, become involved in the inflorescence. You have the central flowers here, and these upper leaves are the attractive organs. So this is what we find in Cornus. Now, what's interesting is that bees are a bit myopic, so they see the flowers, maybe they see the contours of the flowers, but they have one advantage is that they can see in a different field of vision from humans. The bees can see in ultraviolet light, while humans see a bit further in the spectrum. And in fact, flowers have many different variations that you can only see in violet light, in ultraviolet light. So in flowers you have special indicators, we call that nectar guides, that tell the bees where to find the reward in the flower. We can't see it, but the bees can see it. And when you shine ultraviolet light on flowers, you often have you see interesting things. The only problem for bees is that they can't see the red light. So they only see sort of blue or ultraviolet and yellow. So the last cue is the sensory cue. And sometimes you could feel, well, it would be quite interesting to be a bee and land on a flower. First of all, you have this kind of landing platform is quite important with lots of hairs. And about 70% of the flowering plants have specific cells on their petals. So if you look at a petal here, we have what we call conical cells. And these conical cells are very important for bees to have to have a grip to hold on the flower. There are also other functions of the hairs that we don't understand because we are not bees, of course. Now, once the visitor is in the flower, there is a reward system. And the reward system is to make the bees or the pollinator loyal. We want the bee to come back and to pollinate other flowers. And there are different ways to do that. The simplest way is production of pollen grains. Pollen grains are edible. They are a source of energy that insects eat. The problem with pollen grains is that they are quite demanding in energy to produce. Another way is to produce nectar that bees transform in honey. Nectar are quite easy to produce because in the leaves you get photosynthesis that produces sugars and water, and that can be transported to the flowers and serve as food for the pollinator. A bit less common is oil. Certain bees go for oil because they need it for the nest building. So certain flowers have adapted and produced oil. And then we have other flowers that produce something that is edible. We call that food bodies. So insects go in the flower and start eating bits of it. And then the last possibility is creation of a place where insects feel at home to mate. So in pollen flowers, as you can see here, bees like the pollen. You often have a sort of evolution towards flowers that produce more stamens. And more stamens means more pollen. So it's a kind of strategy that they have to attract the pollinator. Nectaries in flowers are areas in the flowers where nectar is produced. And in flowers, there's a whole diversity of places where nectar can be produced. A common one is at the base of the ovary. Here is the ovary. This is a stamen, and you see this is a disc, a nectar disc. This is a young flower of citrus, of oranges. Then we have Helleborus here that produces specific beakers in which the nectar is produced. In this flower, the stamens have already gone, so you don't see any stamens here, but it's the ovary. This is a flower of Diascia, which is a South African species with pink flowers. And at the back of the flowers, there are two spurs. And in these spurs, there is a production of oils that specific bees will collect. And then we have Calicanthus here, which is a big flower that produces food bodies on the top of the stamens that can be eaten by beetles. Now, in flowers, we have, in fact, two kinds of strategies. We have a strategy where the flower caters for, produces the same kind of clothing for everybody. Or we have flowers that are more specific, that produce specific tailored clothing for specific pollinators. So we can speak of generalist versus specialist flowers. So in generalist flowers, the pollinators will be all sorts of insects. And the flower doesn't make a very big difference between who comes to visit. In specialist flowers, the flowers only caters for specific insects. So it excludes the other insects and only one specific insect. And the reason for this evolution is that the flower doesn't want to waste too much pollen. There's a much more precise pollen transfer from one flower to another, thanks to this specialist system. So if we look at a generalist flower, which is quite common, it's a strategy that works in many ways. The flowers will be more or less shallow. This is a rose flower. It's a shallow structure with everything exposed. So you have stamens, carpels. There are also nectaries, as visible here, that are, can be easily accessed. The Helleborus is shown here with this similar process. This is a small flower with a very visible nectary as well. So any kind of insect can come here, beetles, butterflies, flies, and also bees. So the strategy is that the flower produces a lot of pollen, and is at the same time there is a guarantee that fertilization will happen, that the pollination will happen between different individuals. So in specialist flowers, it's like a party. The generalist flower allows everybody in. Specialist flowers is you only get an entrance via a ticket. So only specific pollinators can come in the flower. And the flowers do that in two ways. They do that by producing tubes. So long tubes that restrict the access to the nectar. So only specific pollinators, like here the hummingbird, the colibri, can move to the nectar. Or it can also be by spurs. So a long spur can only give access to a specific pollinator with a longer tongue. And this is a well-known example. This is a Darwin day, and this is an orchid that was discovered in the time of Darwin, Angraecum, from Madagascar. And at that time, so it's an orchid with a very long spur here, and at that time, one didn't know what the pollinator was of this flower. And Darwin postulated that it must be a moth with a very long tongue. And indeed, 30 years later, they discovered the pollinator, which is a kind of a moth with a tongue that goes that far. So we get a kind of restricted access. Now, another way to restrict access is to shut the flowers down and only allow access to very big pollinators, like big bees. And this is Brazil nut, which is Lecithidaceae from Brazil, and only very big bees can sort of push their way in to get to the nectar. This is Antirrhinum, which is more that you probably know, where only strong bees, strong bumblebees, can open the flower to get to the nectar. So that restricts, in fact, the access in a way. So basically, the specialist flowers are at the base of a creation of pollination syndromes, where we have a kind of benefit sharing between a specific insect and a specific flower. So we can have a sort of creation of a specific agreement. What is interesting is that the flowers taps in a certain stage of the life cycle of the insect. That can be the feeding life stage, that can be the reproductive stage, or that can also be nest building stage. So the pollinator has to go to the flower to perform some vital elements for its life cycle. What is also interesting is that these specialist flowers, this interaction with the insects, will create a predictive flower shape. Just by looking at the flower, we can predict what sort of insect will go to these flowers and will pollinate these flowers. So basically, it's a dangerous system also because flowers become highly dependent on the specific pollinator. So if the pollinator goes away, the flower lacks all possibilities to be pollinated, basically. So next, I just want to show you a few pollination syndromes very briefly, because it's have very short time to explain what's all possible. So we have a beetle pollination syndrome that we find in many plants which are usually fragrant. Things like magnolia are beetle pollinated. They have easy access with lots of pollen, food bodies that the beetles can eat. And as you can see, beetles have short mouth parts, so they chew a lot. They create a lot of damage in the flowers, but at the same time, they're effective pollinators. Another way is to create sort of chambers, traps, where the beetles have to sort of stay for a while and do the pollination. A more sort of vague pollination syndrome is what we call bee pollination syndrome, because it has several gradations. And bee pollination is also fly pollination, is also butterfly pollination. Is usually a system where you have a kind of landing platform. So the flowers are, like here, bilaterally symmetrical, and the bee can land on this platform to pollinate the flower, or it can hang down in the flower to get to the nectar. So the reward in these flowers is usually nectar and also pollen, but it's very variable. So it's not a very good pollination system, in fact. Moth pollination is much more precise, because moth pollination is usually linked with nocturnal flowers, which are mainly white, because at the night it's quite difficult to see the colors. And the moth becomes attracted by a very strong fragrance that most sort of evening honeysuckle, for example, flowers in the evening and becomes very attractive to these pollinators. So we don't have any landing platforms here. And we have usually long tubes. So these flowers are always tubular. You can see this here or here. And there's no landing platform because the moth can hover in front of the flower. And as I showed you, the length of the platform of the tube is correlated with the length of the tongue. And the reward is usually nectar, no pollen. So bat pollination is a bit a similar phenomenon, except that bats are more fussy. They become attracted by musty, sort of fermenting smell. The flowers of bat-pollinated plants are usually very much exposed far from the branches, and the bats are a bit destructive. They will eat the pollen, and they will eat and they will sip a lot of nectar as well. So these flowers are usually large, and they have a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen, a lot of stamens. So a last example is a bird-pollinated flowers. And bird-pollinated flowers are usually red because birds can see in the red spectrum, red or orange or highly colored, and they have long tubes. And there are some have a perch, landing platforms where the bird can sort of sit and sip the nectar. But in South America, especially, where there are only hummingbirds, the flowers, the birds have to hover in front of the flower to pollinate. So nectar will be abundant here and will be the reward. Now, the pollination system, the syndromes, can be very rigid, can be very strong, but in some cases they're not that rigid. And it happens frequently in the plant world that there is a shift from one pollination syndrome to another syndrome. And I just show you a number of examples here in one family, the Plantagenaceae, which belong to the Amiales, where we have a whole range in North America of bee-pollinated flowers, where there is a shift in some species to bird-pollinated flowers. So there's the same genus, but we have different species, and the creation of long tubes and red flowers. So there's a kind of easy shift to the bird pollination. Now, an interesting paper shows, in fact, how this is the genus Aquilegia that you probably all know. And Aquilegia has these spurs here at the back of the petals that produce the nectar. And there's an interesting study that shows that so this shows you a tree of the evolution of the genus between different species. And it shows you that the earlier groups are all bee-pollinated in blue, and they have a relatively long, short spur length. Then there is a kind of transition to bird-pollinated flowers in red, and the bird-pollinated flowers are shown here. And there is a further transition to the moth-pollinated flowers, and you can see the moth-pollinated flowers have much larger, much longer spurs. So changing the length of the spurs leads to a much higher speciation, because the flowers manage to tap in a new source of pollinators, which is quite important. We find that in Aquilegia, but we also find it in plants like Tropaeolum or Impatiens. They also have different lengths of spurs, and that creates different pollination strategies, basically. Now, we have discussed systems that work fine, but in some cases, some pollinators or pseudo-pollinators will not perform the service that is demanded from them. So that's what we call nectar thieves. And nectar thieves are quite common. That you find nectar thieves only in specialized pollination syndrome, specialized flowers. So legitimate pollinators will go here, where the bee goes on the landing platform and sips the nectar, which is situated here. But there are certain bees that learn a lesson. They don't have the long tongues, they have shorter tongues, so they decide to make a little hole at the base of the flower to get straight to the nectar. And you often find these little holes in populations or even in gardens when you look at the flowers, and then you know that a nectar thief was present. So the nectar thief don't carry the pollen from one flower to another, of course. We can also have it with ants running over the flows, taking up the nectar, but not doing on pollination. And there is an orchid in North America that is highly endangered, where one specific moth with a very long tongue is cheating, taking out the nectar without performing the pollination because it's too far away to just pick up the pollen. That's for the pollinator. The flowers can also cheat on the pollinator. So basically what the flower does is it asks for the service, it can reproduce, but it doesn't give the reward. So the art of the flower is to lure the insect to come to the flower and to go to another flower as well. And basically we have what we call mimicry, and mimicry is well known in animals. Just imagine certain beetles look like wasps just to avoid being eaten, because birds know that wasps are not nice to eat, are dangerous. So flowers do the same kind of things, but they do it for their pollination. And that can happen within a single species, or it can also happen between two different species from different families. The two slides here that show you pictures of Carica papaya. And papaya, the fruit that you all know, produces male and female plants. So it's dioecious, as male and the males are on one plant. The male produce pollen grains here, but they also produce nectar. And bees visit these flowers, they take out the nectar. When you look at the female flower looks remarkably like the male flower. But the yellow structure that you see here is the stigma. And the stigma doesn't produce any nectar. So this female flower doesn't produce anything as a reward. So bees are fooled to go in these flowers, take the nectar, and then they will visit the female flower and do the pollination without getting something in exchange. You can have it also between two different species, like viola has nectar that is produced in the spur at the back of the flower. And in certain populations, there are some orchids, like Dactylorhiza sambucina, that has little spurs at the back of the flower, but these spurs have no nectar. So both species flower at the same time, and the orchid just take advantage of the presence of the viola and the stupidity of the insect, who will not see the difference. We have this also with carrion flowers, and to an extension with trap flowers. In carrion flowers, this is a genus Tapelia. As I said, carrion flowers carry the smell and the odors of rotten meat, very nice for flies. So the flies are attracted from far away, and they will be convinced by the flower to lay their eggs because it looks so much similar to rotten meat. So you see here, this is an example with flies and the fly eggs that have been laid. Of course, these eggs will hatch, but they will die because there's no food for the flies. So, but at the same time, the flies will carry out the pollination. A more sophisticated mechanism is found here, and the cult genus is a genus Aristolochia, which has flowers that look like big pipes. So we have an entrance here, and we have a chamber in the middle. And the chamber is an open place where here we have the organs, the male and the female organs. And if you look at this drawing here, this shows you the first stage of the pollination, where the flower is in a female stage. We have a fly here, which is covered with pollen that goes into the long tube and ends up in the chamber, but it cannot go out anymore because of the hairs that are blocking the way. The next day, the flower moves from the female to the male stage. So at this stage, this time, the fly has already dropped the pollen on the female parts. The next stage, the mature anthers open, so this is the male phase. The whole flower bends and becomes horizontal, and the hairs shrivel away so that the fly is free again. But the fly has a short memory. It forgets its ordeal, and it will go back to a female flower, to a flower in a female stage, and so carry out the pollination. Now, the ultimate deception of flowers is with bee orchids. And bee orchids have evolved in such a way that they manage to lure a male bee to copulate with the flower. And they take the advantage by the fact that the male bees come out of the ground before the female bees. So the female bees are not present yet. That's the time when the flower is open and when the male bees are around. Now, orchids belong to the group of the monocots. And monocots are plants like tulips. And you know, tulips have 6 petals that in 2 whorls of 3. If you have a look at that, you can see that. It's always 3 plus 3. And orchids do this, have the same. So we have 3 outer sepals here, and there are 3 inner sepals. And what happens is that the inner sepals become transformed. The petals, in fact, become transformed, where the lateral petals become reduced and look more like antennae of an insect, while the third petal evolves in the shape of the body of a female bee. So this is called the labellum, but it looks very much like a female bee. And I must say the bees are a bit myopic, so they don't see the difference between the flower and the insect. You can also see that there are a lot of hairs on this labellum here, and the stamens are situated in little sacs here at the top of the ovary. So we have a very specific pollination system, like this species here, Ophrys speculum, that we find in Italy, has one specific pollinator, which is a wasp called Dascicolia. And this is a male wasp, will be attracted first of all by the pheromones, by the scent. He will go to the flower. Then he will try to mate, and the whole body of the labellum looks very much like a female body. And this male is completely fooled in thinking that it's a female. Maybe find some pleasure in it, I don't know, but it's a fooling system. So what is very interesting is that, so this tree here, there's a phylogeny that, again, so that gives you the evolution of the flowering plants. So we have the gymnosperms here that are wind-pollinated. And what is very interesting that there's a very nice correlation between the evolution of the flowering plants and the evolution of insects. So the lower flowering plants, things like magnoliates, are usually beetle-pollinated. And the beetles are the first insect to appear on Earth to pollinate the flowers. Later on, there is a kind of transference, a return to wind pollination. You can see it happens in certain times. So we have a number of flowers that become wind pollinated again. But this main group here is mainly bee pollinated. And the rosids is a group where the petals are not fused, a bit like roses. They are mostly generalists. So they will be more sort of bee pollinated, sometimes bat pollinated. But it's in the asterids that you get an enormous variation of pollination syndromes because they produce tubes. And you can increase or reduce the length of the tube. So you get all different pollinators here, bird pollinated, moth pollinated, bat, also fly. And the same happens in the monocots here. The groups of the monocots do also the same. They evolved in their own way. So this is quite interesting to see. Now, what is interesting, as I say, that the flowers can also shift back from insect pollination or from animal pollination to wind or sometimes water pollination when the circumstances become less favorable for pollination by insects. Sometimes these plants grow in very windy places, desertification and so on is one of the reasons for that. So what these flowers do, in fact, is they lose all the elements that were there to attract the pollinator. They lose their smell, they lose the odor, they lose the attraction, the visual attraction, and they lose the rewards as well. So pollinators are not attracted anymore. What happens also is that the flowers become unisexual. So you've got male flowers and female flowers. Males are usually in large numbers because the wind will transport the pollen to the female parts, which are more sort of alone. So these are just 3 examples to show that. What's interesting is that this system can move back to insect pollination in some cases. The whole problem with that is that these flowers have evolved in such a way that petals have gone complete, have been lost completely, and that the flower has become very simple. So even the genetic potential to produce petals has been lost. So this problem, these flowers have a problem. There's the flowers that move back to insect pollination. They have the problem that there are no petals and no information present to create the petals. So how do they solve that? And we have that in the azo-azo, in the Mesembryanthemums, for example, where we have a flower that looks very much like a composite, but in fact all the organs here are stamens, sterile stamens, stamens that became attractive, but that lost the way to reproduce, to produce pollen. So that's one way to attract insects again and to affect sort of pollination. The other way is found here in euphorbia. So this structure here is not a flower. It's a pseudo-flower. It's a grouping of flowers. And the structure, the central structure here is a female flower. So it's, in fact, a flower that is completely naked. There's no perianth anymore. It's just an ovary with 3 styles. And the little organs that you find here in the middle, these are stamens. But the stamens, each single stamen is a male flower. So the flowers have become reduced to only 1 stamen. Now, these two came back together, and the organs around here are just upper leaves that move up and that produce nectar and that become attractive. The whole structure becomes a kind of secondary flower to attract pollinators. So let me conclude here. The question is, why should we care about sex and flowers? So it's a remarkable evolution where, in fact, the plants lead the game in the evolution. So the plants tap on the availability of pollinators, and they change so that they can sort of become different and become different species as well. So it's a balanced co-evolution between the pollinators and the flowers. The pollinators are just there, and they can be used by the flowers. And we have a big responsibility as humans. You probably heard about the recent problems with neonicotinoid pesticides that were killing the bees. So in Europe, there is a ban now on neonicotinoids, which is quite important because pollinators need to be respected. They are so important, and they are really at the basis of our whole food chain. I would just want to end with the possibilities that flowers have. This is a bit anthropomorphic, of course, because it looks like a monkey and this looks like a bird, but these are 2 orchids that have specific means to attract very specific pollinators. So thank you very much for your attention.